the specification letter that Halvor Brecken mailed east in the spring of 1886 asked for a wife as a careful man orders lumber by the list, sight unseen, and trusting the description to hold true. He wanted a woman who was quiet, biddable, thrifty, and church-going. A woman who kept a still tongue and a clean hearth, and above all. And here he pressed the pencil hard enough to score the paper, a woman with no opinions on timber or trade. The woman who answered had been scaling logs on a Michigan rollway since she was 9 years old, and could tell a sound stick from a sold one with the flat of her hand. This is the story of how a man who ordered a wife with no say in timber got the only pair of eyes in the county that could see the rot a smiling dealer had sold the town, and stopped a roof before it came down on the children who were meant to sit beneath it. Norsk Landing, Minnesota was a pinery town on a log drive river, the kind of place that smelled of green sawdust 9 months of the year and wood smoke the other 3. Halvor Brecken was its stuttiest carpenter and at 40 its loneliest widower. He had built 40 things in that valley that still stood, a white church, a granary, 24 square and honest houses, and exactly one thing he could not build, which was a letter to a stranger asking her to come and share them. That is a specific carpentry a lonely man practices at the kitchen table, late, with the stub of a pencil, and Halvor practiced it for the better part of a month before he got it to stand. He sat that spring on the schoolhouse building committee, and here is where a good builder's single weakness showed itself. Halvor trusted a handshake. He believed, with the whole untroubled arithmetic of a man who had never once been cheated, that another man's word was as square as his own. So when Orrin Vass, the lumber dealer with the wide smile and the wider woodlot, offered to furnish the entire schoolhouse frame at prime price, and still come in under budget, Halvor shook his hand and thanked Providence for the bargain, and wrote the figure down as settled. The bride who stepped off the afternoon train was named Maudit Solberg, and she was 26. She was the daughter of a Michigan timber cruiser, raised on rollways and in the scaling shanties where men marked down what a log was worth. And she carried 2 things east that no other bride in the county's history had thought to pack: her dead father's brass-tipped scale rule and his cruising book thumbed soft at the corners. She could read a standing pine for soundness the way other people read a face, and she knew every crooked trick a dealer plays because her father had taught her each one so that no man would ever play it on her. She had answered Halvor's letter for the strangest of reasons. Amid all the clauses about quiet and thrift, 3 lines had been honest in a way the writer had not meant to be. He had written that he wanted the schoolhouse built right and built to last for other men's children, having none of his own to gain by it. A woman who has spent her life around men who cut corners learns to hear the rare man who will not. She got off the train and did not ask about the house or the acres or the man's age. She asked whose mill had cut the schoolhouse lumber and by what rule it had been scaled. Halvor, flustered, did the only thing a nervous man with a list ever does. He began reading her back his own specifications. "It says here quiet," he said, and biddable, and no opinions on. And just then a teamster's wagon rolled past the depot stacked high with squared timber. The fresh pine, bright as butter in the sun, bound for the raising ground. Merritt turned her head and looked at the load the way a doctor looks at a cough. "That 3rd stick from the top is shaken through the heart," she said. "The 2 under it are cull, overscaled and painted as prime. Whoever sold you that measured with a crooked rule." The wagon had not yet cleared the platform. Halvor closed his mouth around the rest of the word, opinions. They negotiated terms that evening at the same table where the letter had been born, and she laid them out plainly. "I will keep your house, and I will keep it well," she said. "But any timber that goes into a building I am to worship in or teach in, I scale first. You do not sign a lumber bill I have not walked. And I keep the right to say no to a thing without explaining myself to a soul." Halvor, who had ordered a bride with no views of her own, found he had somehow agreed to all three before the coffee went cold. The schoolhouse frame went up fast and cheap on Vass's lumber, and the town praised the bargain to the rafters that were not yet on it. And all the while the new bride circled the stacked beams at the raising ground with her father's brass rule in one hand and a hatchet in the other, knocking, listening, marking the butt ends with a nub of chalk. She would set the flat of her hand on a squared stick and knock it once with the pole of the hatchet and cock her head at the sound as if it were a cracked bell. The town watched and the town talked. They took to calling her the timber bride, half in affection and half in mockery, a woman who fingered lumber like a horse trader worrying a mare's teeth. Halvor pretended not to watch her from the sawhorses, but every night, without being asked, he took her hatchet to the whetstone and put an edge on it fine enough to shave with, and set it back by the door. And every dawn she carried a tin cup of coffee out to the cold beam where she worked, and left it steaming on the wood, and he understood, without either of them ever saying it, that the cup was not for her. At the building committee supper, the men ribbed him. "Brecken's wife inspects his lumber for him," one said, to laughter. "Knew the trade before his own two hands did." And Halvor, who was a good man and a proud one and tired that night of being the joke of his own table, turned to her when they were home and said the coldest thing in him. "Did you answer my letter for a husband?" he asked, "or for a woodpile to argue with?" Merritt did not dignify it with a reply. She set down the cup, and she went up the stairs, and the house stayed quiet for a week, while out at the raising ground the roof timbers lay stacked and waiting to go on. The raising day came bright and blue-skied. The whole town gathered to set the roof, and Orrin Vasse, standing among them in his good coat, honored aloud as the honest dealer who had come in under budget. The men had the first rafter half lifted on the pike poles when Marit Solberg stepped up onto the sill and asked the committee for 1 hour before a single peg went home. She had her father's rule and her father's book, and she read the fraud out in front of God and the town. "Your bill charges prime clear count," she said, and she rescaled the pile, stick by stick, aloud, so every man could follow the tally. It came up a third short. "Cull logs written down as prime," she said, "overscaled with a crooked stick." She turned a beam and showed them the ring shake and the wind shake running hidden along the grain of wood that looked sound on every face, the splits that would open under the first heavy snow. Then she took up the hatchet Halvor had sharpened and drove it into a sill that had rung hollow under her knuckles, and it sank to the eye in punky brown dote, dry rot grown at the very heart of a stick, clear and clean on every side you could see. "And these green joists," she said, "unseasoned, sold you wet, will shrink and rack this whole frame out of true by spring." Vasse blustered, and Vasse smiled, and Vasse called it a woman's fancy. But a hatchet buried to the eye in rot does not argue back, and the town had watched it go in. Wood cannot hide its heart from a hand that knows where to knock, and it takes a man with a crooked rule to make honest pine tell a lie. His contract was voided on the sill he was caught standing on. Halvor Brecken climbed up beside his wife and turned to the committee. "My order," he said, asked for a woman with no opinions on timber. She has got exactly one. That you knock a beam and believe your own hand before you believe a smiling bill. And that one opinion just kept this roof off the heads of every child in this county, and gave every honest mill on this river back the trade this man stole from them. Nobody laughed at the timber bride after that. They did not ruin Orrin Vasse. Merritt would not have it. He was made to replace the cull at his own cost and refund the town to the last dollar, and then he was allowed to keep his mill and his name on the one condition that he scale honest for the rest of his days. Corrected and left standing. The frame was pulled and rebuilt from scaled, seasoned stock before the first snow flew. That night, at the kitchen table, Halvor asked her at last why she had answered a stranger's list of specifications at all. Because a man who writes 3 honest lines about building right for other men's children, she said, with nothing in it to gain for himself, is a man whose house a woman can trust to stand. They married that December in the church he had built. The Norsk Landing School stood 90 years, and Marit Solberg Brecken scaled every public timber in that county until the railroad came, and the rule she taught the committee, the only one she ever wrote on the wall of the school, was 2 words long: knock it first. He died in 1924, and she in 1931. And they were buried side by side on the rise above the school she saved. He had ordered a wife with no opinions, because opinions had always cost him. The single opinion he got taught the whole county the only rule that ever holds a roof up. Sound is what a thing is at the heart, not what it shows on the face. And so, it turns out, is a marriage. If this story stayed with you, tell me. What was the moment you knew merit was never going to be a thing that man ordered? Stay with me, and I will tell you next about the woman they sent to keep a lighthouse she was told she could never keep alone.